At 14 years old, Brandon Mitchell sat in that Seattle courtroom with a confidence that unnerved everyone who saw him. While most teenagers his age were worried about acne and school dances, Brandon had already committed an act so calculating and brutal that veteran detectives would later describe it as one of the most disturbing cases of their careers. He genuinely believed his youth would shield him from consequences, that the justice system would see him as a child who made a terrible mistake rather than the predator he truly was. What Brandon didn't know was that a single strand of hair, his hair, found clutched in his victim's hand, had already sealed his fate. That microscopic piece of evidence would prove to be the thread that unraveled his carefully constructed lie and exposed the monster hiding behind the face of a seemingly ordinary teenage boy. The question that would haunt Seattle for years wasn't just what happened, but how. How does a 14-year-old develop the capacity for such calculated violence? How does someone so young learn to mimic human emotions so perfectly while feeling absolutely nothing inside? And most disturbingly, how many people had looked into Brandon Mitchell's eyes over the years and seen only a bright, polite young man when they should have seen the warning signs of a predator in training? This is the story of a crime that shattered a community's sense of safety and forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth: that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious signs, and sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones we least suspect. Seattle in the fall of 2023 was experiencing one of its famously gray and rainy autumns, the kind of weather that drives people indoors and creates a sense of cozy isolation. In the Capitol Hill neighborhood, where Victorian homes stood alongside modern condos, life moved with the comfortable rhythm of an established community, where neighbors knew each other's names and local coffee shops served as informal community centers. Sarah Bennett was 26 years old and had recently moved to Seattle from Portland to take a position as a social worker specializing in at-risk youth. It was a job she was passionate about, having grown up in foster care herself and understanding firsthand the challenges faced by children in the system. Her colleagues at the King County Department of Children and Family Services described her as dedicated, empathetic, and perhaps a bit too trusting, a quality that came from her genuine belief in the inherent goodness of people, especially young people. Sarah lived alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on a tree-lined street, a cozy space she had filled with plants, books, and the kind of eclectic decor that spoke to someone still figuring out their adult identity. She was a runner, often seen jogging through Volunteer Park in the early mornings, and she volunteered at a local youth center on weekends, teaching art classes to teenagers from troubled backgrounds. Friends would later describe Sarah as the kind of person who would stop to help a stranger, who saw potential in everyone, who believed that with the right support and guidance, any troubled young person could turn their life around. It was this compassionate worldview, this fundamental belief in redemption and second chances, that would make her vulnerable to the predator who had been watching her for weeks. Brandon Mitchell first encountered Sarah at the Eastside Youth Center, where she volunteered on Saturday afternoons. He had been court-ordered to attend the center's after-school program following an incident at his middle school, a fight with another student that had been dismissed as typical adolescent aggression, though the school counselor had noted in her report that Brandon's level of violence had seemed disproportionate and concerning. At the youth center, Brandon was a model participant. He attended Sarah's art classes, always polite, always engaged, displaying a talent for drawing that impressed both Sarah and the other instructors. He asked thoughtful questions about her life, showed interest in her career, and seemed to hang on her every word when she spoke about her own experience in foster care and how she had overcome adversity. To Sarah, Brandon represented exactly the kind of kid she had entered social work to help: intelligent, creative, troubled by his past, but eager for guidance and connection. She saw his attendance at the youth center as a positive sign, evidence that despite his behavioral issues, he was trying to make better choices. What Sarah didn't see, what no one saw, was that Brandon wasn't there for rehabilitation or personal growth. He was there hunting. And Sarah Bennett, with her kindness and her willingness to see the best in him, had become his chosen prey. Brandon's approach was methodical and patient, exhibiting a level of strategic thinking that would later shock investigators when they pieced together the timeline of his planning. He began by establishing himself as a troubled but redeemable kid, someone who responded well to Sarah's mentorship and seemed to be making genuine progress. He would arrive early to her art classes and stay late asking for extra help with projects. He confided in her about difficulties at home, embellishing and sometimes fabricating stories of neglect and emotional abuse designed to elicit her sympathy and protective instincts. He knew exactly which emotional buttons to push to keep her engaged and invested in his well-being. Sarah, true to her nature and training, responded exactly as Brandon had calculated she would. She began checking in with him between classes, sending encouraging text messages about his artwork, and even offering to meet with him and his parents to discuss strategies for improving his home environment. She documented their interactions carefully, maintaining appropriate professional boundaries while still providing the kind of emotional support she believed he needed. What Sarah didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that every interaction was being carefully cataloged by Brandon for a different purpose. He was learning her patterns, her routines, her vulnerabilities. He noted when she went running, what route she took, when she got home from work, when her apartment lights turned off at night. Brandon kept a journal, later discovered by police, in which he documented his observations of Sarah with clinical precision. The entries were disturbing not just for their content, but for their tone, completely devoid of emotion, written as if he were studying an insect rather than planning to harm a human being who had shown him nothing but kindness. October 15th, 2023. Target runs at 6:30 a.m., takes same route through Volunteer Park, always wears headphones, never looks behind her. This could work. October 22, 2023. She lives alone, no boyfriend that I can see. Parents live in Oregon. Talked to them on phone last Tuesday night. Apartment is ground floor. Window doesn't lock properly. Noticed this when I walked past on my way to the bus stop. October 28, 2023. She trusts me completely now. Asked me to help set up for the youth center's Halloween party. We'll be there alone tomorrow evening preparing. This might be the opportunity. The entries revealed a level of premeditation that was chilling in anyone, but particularly in someone barely into his teenage years. Brandon wasn't acting on impulse or uncontrolled rage. He was planning, calculating, and patiently waiting for the perfect moment to strike. That moment came on October 31st, 2023, Halloween night. Halloween in Seattle is typically a low-key affair compared to other cities, with most of the festivities focused on family-friendly neighborhood trick-or-treating and costume parties at local bars. Sarah had volunteered to help set up for the Eastside Youth Center's Halloween party, which was scheduled for the following evening. The center was supposed to be closed, but she had a key and had gotten permission from the director to work after hours. She was alone, expecting to spend a few quiet hours hanging decorations and setting up game stations before heading home. What Sarah didn't know was that Brandon had manipulated the situation to create this exact scenario. He had volunteered to help with setup, telling Sarah he wanted to give back to the center and show appreciation for all she had done for him. Sarah, touched by this gesture and seeing it as evidence of his personal growth, had readily agreed. Brandon arrived at 6 p.m.,
right on schedule. Security camera footage from a neighboring business would later show him entering the building carrying a backpack that seemed unusually full and heavy. He was wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, and investigators would note that he looked directly at the camera for just a moment, not with the furtive glance of someone trying to avoid detection, but with what appeared to be confidence, even arrogance. What happened in the next 90 minutes inside the East Side Youth Center would be partially reconstructed through forensic evidence, since Brandon initially denied everything, and Sarah could not tell her own story. But the physical evidence painted a clear and horrifying picture of premeditated violence.
According to the forensic timeline established by investigators, Brandon spent approximately 30 minutes working alongside Sarah, helping her hang decorations and set up tables. He was charming and helpful, just as he had been throughout their entire relationship. Sarah had no reason to suspect anything was wrong. At approximately 6:45 p.m., Brandon made his move. The attack was sudden and brutal. Brandon struck Sarah from behind with a hammer he had brought in his backpack, hitting her repeatedly in the head with enough force to incapacitate her, but not enough to kill her immediately. This detail would prove crucial later. It demonstrated that Brandon wasn't acting in a blind rage, but was controlling his violence, delivering calculated blows designed to subdue rather than immediately kill. Sarah fought back desperately. The crime scene showed evidence of a significant struggle. Overturned chairs, decorations torn down, blood spatter patterns indicating Sarah had tried to crawl toward the door. In those final moments, as Brandon strangled her with a length of electrical cord he had also brought in his backpack, Sarah managed to tear a tuft of hair from his head, a desperate, final act of resistance that would ultimately bring her killer to justice. Brandon left Sarah's body in the youth center storage room, covered it with some old gym mats, and calmly walked out of the building at approximately 7:30 p.m. Security footage from the neighboring business showed him leaving with his backpack, his hoodie pulled up, walking with the same casual gait he had arrived with. There was no running, no obvious signs of panic or distress. He looked like a teenager heading home after an ordinary evening. Sarah's body was discovered the following morning, November 1st, by Thomas Chen, the youth center's director, who had arrived early to finish party preparations. His screams brought several neighbors running, and within minutes, Seattle Police Department officers were on scene, securing what was immediately recognized as a homicide. Detective Rebecca Hawkins, a 20-year veteran of SPD's homicide unit, was the lead investigator assigned to the case. She arrived at the youth center at 8:45 a.m. and was immediately struck by several aspects of the crime scene that didn't fit typical patterns. The level of violence was extraordinary, Hawkins would later testify. But it was also controlled. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong. Whoever did this had come prepared with weapons, had taken time to cover the body, and had left the scene calmly enough not to draw attention. We were looking for someone organized, someone with significant planning capability. What Hawkins couldn't initially comprehend was that she was looking for a 14-year-old boy.
The investigation began with the standard protocol, interviewing everyone who knew Sarah, examining her phone and email for threats or concerning communications, reviewing her recent casework for clients who might have posed a danger. Sarah's colleagues at the Department of Children and Family Services were devastated, but helpful, providing access to her case files and offering insights into her recent work. One name came up repeatedly in interviews: Brandon Mitchell. Multiple people mentioned that Sarah had been working closely with him at the youth center, that she had spoken hopefully about his progress, that he had volunteered to help with the Halloween party setup. When Detective Hawkins first contacted Brandon's family on November 2nd for a routine interview, she was met with cooperation and concern. Brandon's parents, Linda and Robert Mitchell, were shocked by Sarah's death and immediately made their son available for questioning. They described Brandon as a good kid,
who had had some behavioral issues at school but was working hard to improve. They mentioned that Sarah had been a positive influence on him and that they were grateful for her mentorship. Brandon himself, interviewed at his home in the presence of his parents, was the picture of grief and shock. He cried when told of Sarah's death, expressed disbelief that anyone would want to hurt her, and spoke eloquently about what a wonderful person she had been. He confirmed he had planned to help with party setup, but said he had gotten the day wrong and thought it was scheduled for November 2nd, not October 31st. "I feel so guilty," Brandon said, tears streaming down his face. "If I had been there, maybe I could have protected her. Maybe this wouldn't have happened." His performance was so convincing that Detective Hawkins initially cleared him as a suspect, noting in her report that he seemed genuinely distraught and cooperative. She had no reason to suspect that the tears were manufactured, that the grief was performed, that she was sitting across from Sarah Bennett's killer. The investigation continued for 3 more days with no solid leads. Sarah's phone records showed nothing suspicious. Her casework revealed no clients with violent histories or grudges against her. Security footage from the neighborhood showed various people walking past the youth center, but no one who appeared to be casing the building or acting suspiciously. It wasn't until November 5th, when the forensic analysis of evidence collected from Sarah's body came back from the state crime lab, that the case broke wide open. The Washington State Patrol Crime Laboratory processed dozens of pieces of evidence from Sarah's body and clothing: fibers, blood samples, DNA from under her fingernails, and crucially, the tuft of hair she had clutched in her right hand. The hair was analyzed using mitochondrial DNA testing, a sophisticated technique that can identify individuals even from degraded samples. The lab ran the DNA profile through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, but found no matches. Not surprising, since the killer had no prior criminal record that would have required DNA collection. But what forensic analyst Dr. Jennifer Park noticed was that the hair belonged to a male with specific genetic markers indicating European ancestry in adolescence based on the hair's growth patterns and chemical composition. This finding led Dr. Park to suggest a novel approach. If they had a suspect pool, they could request voluntary DNA samples for comparison. Detective Hawkins made the decision to request voluntary DNA samples from all males who had been at the youth center in the days leading up to Sarah's murder: staff members, volunteers, and participants in the programs, including minors with parental consent. Most people agreed readily, wanting to help solve the murder of a beloved community member. Linda and Robert Mitchell, when contacted, immediately consented to having Brandon's DNA collected. They had no reason to refuse, no suspicion that their son could be involved in anything nefarious. Brandon himself seemed unfazed by the request, even asking the crime scene technician questions about how DNA testing worked with what appeared to be genuine curiosity. The DNA sample was processed with priority given the urgent nature of the investigation. On November 8th, Dr. Park called Detective Hawkins with results that would stun the investigative team. The hair from the victim's hand is a familial match to Brandon Mitchell, Dr. Park said. I've run the analysis 3 times to confirm. The likelihood that this is his hair is 99.97%. There's no doubt, Detective, that hair belongs to him. Hawkins sat in silence for a long moment, processing the implications. A 14-year-old boy, a kid who had cried in front of her, who had seemed so genuinely devastated by Sarah's death. A child. But the science didn't lie. And suddenly all the pieces of the case began to rearrange themselves into a horrifying new picture. On November 9th, Detective Hawkins and her partner, Detective Marcus Williams, arrived at the Mitchell family home with a search warrant and a warrant for Brandon's arrest. The shock on Linda and Robert Mitchell's faces when informed their son was being arrested for murder was profound and genuine. They truly had no idea what their son was capable of.
Brandon was taken into custody without incident, showing none of the emotion he had displayed during the first interview. His affect was flat, almost bored, as he was read his Miranda rights and transported to the Juvenile Detention Center for processing. The interrogation began at 2:30 p.m. in a small, windowless interview room designed specifically for interviewing minors, less institutional than adult interrogation rooms, with softer lighting and comfortable chairs meant to put young suspects at ease. Brandon sat across from Detectives Hawkins and Williams, his public defender, Martha Rodriguez, seated beside him. For the first 2 hours, Brandon maintained his innocence. He couldn't explain how his hair had ended up in Sarah's hand. He suggested it must have been from an earlier interaction, perhaps from one of the art classes. When Hawkins pointed out that Sarah had clearly torn the hair out during a struggle, the roots were intact, indicating forcible removal, Brandon just shrugged and said he didn't understand how it could have happened. The breakthrough came when Hawkins made a calculated decision to lay out all the evidence they had gathered. The security footage showing him entering and leaving the building within the right frame time, the hammer and electrical cord found in his bedroom closet that matched the murder weapons discovered during the search warrant execution that morning, and most damning, the journal. Brandon's journal had been hidden under a loose floorboard in his closet, containing months of entries documenting his observations of Sarah, his plans, and most chillingly, his motivations. When Hawkins began reading excerpts from the journal aloud, Brandon's demeanor finally shifted. His attorney immediately advised him to remain silent, but Brandon ignored her. Instead, he smiled, a cold, calculating expression that sent chills through both detectives. "You want to know why?" Brandon asked, leaning forward. "Because I wanted to see if I could do it. Because she was so trusting, so convinced she could save me. It was pathetic. She made it easy." What followed was a confession that was remarkable not for its remorse, there was none, but for its detail and the disturbing pride with which Brandon described his crime. He walked the detectives through every step of his planning, explaining his thought process with the detached analysis of someone describing a science experiment rather than a murder.
"I've been thinking about killing someone for years," Brandon explained calmly. "I started with animals when I was 9, neighborhood cats mostly, a few dogs. But that got boring. I knew eventually I'd want to try it with a person. Sarah was perfect because she trusted me completely. I knew I could get her alone." He described choosing the youth center as the location because he knew the security camera placement and could avoid being clearly identified. He explained that he had brought multiple weapons because he wanted options and had planned the attack down to the minute. When Hawkins asked him if he felt any remorse for what he had done, Brandon looked genuinely puzzled by the question. "Why would I?" he replied. "She was just there. She existed and then she didn't. I don't feel bad about it any more than you'd feel bad about turning off a light switch." The complete absence of empathy, the casual way he discussed ending Sarah's life, was more chilling than any display of rage or violence could have been. This wasn't a teenager who had made a terrible mistake in a moment of poor judgment. This was a predator who had carefully planned and executed a murder simply to satisfy his curiosity about what it would be like to kill someone. The confession was recorded, transcribed, and would become the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Brandon Mitchell had not only admitted to murdering Sarah Bennett, he had done so in a way that demonstrated clear premeditation, complete lack of remorse, and a level of danger to society that would make him one of the youngest people in Washington state history to be tried as an adult for first-degree murder.
The hearing to determine whether Brandon Mitchell would be tried as an adult took place over 3 days in December 2023, presided over by Judge Patricia Winters, a respected jurist known for her careful deliberation in complex juvenile cases. The prosecution presented its case first, with Deputy Prosecutor Sarah Kim methodically laying out the evidence of premeditation. Brandon's journal entries documenting months of planning, his careful selection of weapons, his manipulation of the situation to get Sarah alone, and his post-crime behavior that demonstrated consciousness of guilt. This was not a spontaneous act by a child whose brain was not fully developed, Kim argued. This was a calculated murder, planned and executed by someone who understood exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Brandon Mitchell documented his own planning process in meticulous detail. He chose his victim deliberately. He brought specific weapons to the scene. He waited for the perfect opportunity. And after he killed Sarah Bennett, he attempted to cover up the crime and showed no remorse whatsoever. Kim then called Detective Hawkins to the stand to testify about Brandon's confession, playing the videotaped interrogation for Judge Winters. Watching Brandon calmly describe his crime, explaining his motivations with disturbing casualness, was jarring for everyone in the courtroom, including Brandon's own parents, who sat in the gallery with tears streaming down their faces. The prosecution's psychiatric expert, Dr. Morgan, testified about her evaluation and her conclusions regarding Brandon's danger to society. She explained that while most juvenile offenders could benefit from rehabilitative interventions, psychopathy was different. It was a personality structure rather than a treatable mental illness, and there was limited evidence that traditional therapeutic approaches were effective in changing the core characteristics of the condition. My concern, Dr. Morgan testified, is that if Brandon were to remain in the juvenile system, he would be released at age 21 with no further supervision. Given his clear enjoyment of the power and control involved in killing, his stated interest in doing it again, and his complete lack of genuine remorse, I believe there is a substantial risk he would commit further violent acts. The adult system, with the possibility of life imprisonment, is the only way to ensure public safety. The defense countered with their own expert testimony and arguments about adolescent brain development. Dr. Landis spent hours on the stand explaining the neuroscience of teenage decision-making, showing brain scans and research studies demonstrating that 14-year-olds simply don't have the same capacity for impulse control and future planning as adults. Martha Rodriguez, Brandon's public defender, made an impassioned argument about the purpose of the juvenile justice system and the importance of giving young offenders a chance at redemption. Yes, Brandon committed a terrible crime, but he is still a child. The juvenile system exists precisely for cases like this, to provide treatment, rehabilitation, and the possibility of change. To give up on a 14-year-old, to say that he is irredeemable and beyond help, goes against everything we claim to believe about children and their capacity for growth.
On April 8, 2024, the trial of State of Washington versus Brandon Mitchell commenced in King County Superior Court. The courtroom was packed with media representatives, legal observers, members of Sarah Bennett's family, and Seattle residents drawn by the sensational nature of the case. A 14-year-old on trial for meticulously planning and executing the murder of his mentor.